Is it sad that Jane Austen never got married? Remember 2 weeks ago when I made a video in which I rambled at you about Jane Austen for well over 10 minutes? I remember when you thought that I had probably said everything I had to say about Jane Austen for a while. You were wrong. I think because until last month I'd been working at the Jane Austen Centre for nearly a year, I'd gotten into the habit of talking about Jane Austen 8 hours a day, 3 or 4 days a week, and suddenly I don't have to do that anymore, and I don't know what to do with all my Jane Austen thoughts. I just don't know where to put them, so I'm putting them here. When I was working at the Jane Austen Centre, one of the things that people commented on all the time or asked me questions about was Jane Austen's love life. A lot of people would ask me how accurate the film Becoming Jane was, for example. A lot of people would ask, you know, who was Mr. Darcy based on? And on a weekly, if not daily basis, when I was working at the Jane Austen Centre, visitors would come up to me and say, isn't it really sad that Jane Austen never got married? And for a while I would nod along and I'd say, yeah, you know, it is really sad. Look at her books. They're so centred on love in many ways, and she treats love as this amazing, wonderful thing, and it's sad that she never found that. But then, after a little while, I started thinking, well, is it really that sad? First of all, I wanted to go through the reason why people were making that comment, the reason why people thought that and said it. Part of the reason, I think, is to do with the film Becoming Jane. The film Becoming Jane came out in 2007, and it's basically a loosely biographical film about Jane Austen's life, about her when she was in her early 20s, and about her relationship primarily with this man, Thomas Lefroy. We know that she knew this man, we know that she met him, we know that she danced with him, we know that she, in her words, was flirting with him, but that's basically all we know. We have 2 mentions of him in her letters, and that's it. The film Becoming Jane really exaggerates this, really romanticises her relationship with him, tries to fit her life into Pride and Prejudice, squishes a lot of other historical events into one short space of time, etc. So it's not very accurate, but I can understand why a lot of people who've seen this film want to know more about like her love life and her relationship with this man. I actually really like the film Becoming Jane. I think it's really fun. I think it's quite good. It's not accurate, but that's not really the point, and it's still enjoyable anyway. However, I do think that is part of the reason why people were asking that question. I do think the film had an influence on it. However, another reason why people asked it, I think it's because there is a sort of social and cultural idea in society that to be like a success in life, you have to be in a relationship. You see that in a lot of films and a lot of books, this idealization of love as the only route to happiness. And I think that's a shame, and I think it's dangerous. And I think it's especially dangerous because it's more to do with women than men. In general, in books and films, especially in films, you have a lot more men who end up single and are perfectly happy and successful single than you do have women, and that's a shame and that's a problem. And I think that probably plays partly into the reason why people ask about Jane Austen's love life. Perhaps the main and most obvious reason why people want to know about Jane Austen's love life is because she wrote a lot of amazing love stories. At the heart of most of her books there is a central love story. The plot tends to be driven by, as I said previously, love and money, but a lot of people focus on love. However, Dickens wrote a lot of really good love stories. There's a lot of love stories at the heart of all his novels, and I've never heard anyone say, oh, Dickens wrote such amazing love stories. Isn't it sad that he had such a tempestuous personal life and that him and his wife split up, etc. Never hear anyone say that. And maybe that's just because people view Jane Austen's novels as more romantic than they do Dickens, but I don't think it's entirely that. However, it is true that in Jane Austen's 6 main novels, the heroines all end married, and love is kind of put on not quite a pedestal, but it is seen as a kind of aim in life for these women that Jane Austen is writing about. So I completely understand why people want to know about Jane Austen's love life. I understand why people think it's sad that Jane Austen never got married. However, I want to put across a few ideas and theories why maybe it isn't that sad at all. Firstly, going back to the presentation of love in her books. Yes, all her heroines tend to end married, and there is a idealization of love in that sense, but when we look at the actual presentation of marriage in its older state in her books, it isn't nearly quite so positive. If you think about Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, they're not really happy. They're not having a great fun time being married, are they? Or the Prices in Mansfield Park, also not a happy couple. There are a lot of examples in Jane Austen's books of married couples that are not very happy. There are certainly, admittedly, other married couples that are happy. If we think about the Crofts in Persuasion, there is an example of an older married couple who seem really happy, but Jane Austen certainly didn't have a completely idealised view of marriage. Her books definitely show that marriage is not just all happy, and she didn't idealise it in that way, so maybe she wouldn't have wanted it for herself. Secondly, on a kind of side note, if we take the assumption that Jane Austen was never in love, isn't it really cool, and doesn't it show a lot about her skill as a writer, that she wrote these amazing love stories that talk about love in a very interesting way and that explore what it's like leading up to marriage. Doesn't it show what a good writer she was, that she could write all this without being in love and without having experienced that as her characters do? And isn't that kind of cool and good in a literary way? Number 3. This is very important. In Jane Austen's time, the difference between being married and unmarried in terms of your life and the way you lived was so massive. It wasn't just a case of falling in love or not. If Jane Austen had got married, she would have led a completely different life. And we in fact know that Jane Austen had the opportunity to get married. When she was 28, the younger brother of some good friends of hers proposed to her. She said yes, and then 12 hours later, the next day, she said no, and she decided she didn't want to marry him. And this has gone down in Austen history as Jane Austen deciding not to marry a man she didn't truly love because of course she wanted to aim for that ideal of love that you see in all her books. But actually, maybe she also decided that she didn't want to get married. In my video 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the pressure on women in Jane Austen's time to get married. Not only a social pressure, but an economic pressure. And many of the women in Jane Austen's books feel both the social pressure and the economic pressure. If we think about the Dashwood girls or the sisters in Pride and Prejudice, they all have a real economic pressure to get married. But Jane Austen didn't really have that. Of course, she wasn't independent on her own, but her brothers were all very successful and could afford to support her. And because she was the youngest of 7 children, many of her brothers had already sort of made their fortune, made their way in the world, and could support her and her elder sister. So in that sense, she was quite lucky in that she didn't have the economic pressure to get married, only really the social pressure. So maybe she actually decided not to get married because she didn't want to. Because, number 4, and this is the most important one, if Jane Austen had got married, we might not have her novels. The fact is, she just might not have had the time. As I said, being an unmarried and being a married woman in Jane Austen's time meant a very, very different life experience. Let's take, for example, one of Jane Austen's sister-in-laws, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was married to Jane Austen's brother Edward. Elizabeth got married at the age of 18 and died 17 years later in childbirth with her 11th child. She spent the majority of her adult life pregnant, and the rest of it probably running after the rest of her massive family. The chances are that if Jane Austen had got married, she might have spent a lot of her life pregnant and running after children too. The fact is that for various social and biological reasons, people tended to have a lot larger families in Jane Austen's day, and if the rest of the Austen family tree is to go by, they were quite a fertile family. They tended to have a lot of children. And if Jane Austen had got married and had lots of children, chances are she wouldn't have had the time to write, and she just wouldn't have done so. For example, we know that one of Jane Austen's nieces, Anna, was writing a novel before she got married. We have various letters from Jane Austen to Anna talking about Anna's novel and commenting on her manuscript, suggesting some edits for her. But then Anna got married, in fact, to a cousin of Thomas Lefroy, a man called Ben Lefroy, and after Anna got married, she never wrote another word. We have no record of her book, her manuscript is gone, and we know that after she got married, she just didn't write. Not because her husband was opposed to it, but just because she didn't have the time. Anna never wrote again, and for all that we know, if Jane Austen had got married, she might never have written again either. We know that Jane Austen wrote first drafts of several of her books before she was 23, but the fact is that she didn't edit those, write new ones, or get them published until she was in her 30s, by which time, chances are, if she'd have got married, she would have already done so. So, if Jane Austen had got married, we might not have had her books. And I think that's pretty sad both for her and for us. Of course, we are never going to know whether Jane Austen regretted later on in life that she hadn't got married, whether she wished she had found that love that all the people find in her books. We will never ever know that. But personally, in my head, I don't think she was. When you read the letters she was writing at the end of her life, they don't read like the letters of an unhappy woman. And even if she didn't have romantic love in her life, she had so many other kinds of important love. She had a lot of really close friends that she wrote with, one that she lived with, and she was very, very close with her sister, who she lived with all her life. We also know she had a very good relationship with all of her brothers and many close friends amongst her nieces and nephews who she really loved, and she was in correspondence with so many of them. She had a massive supportive family, and also, most of all, she loved her books. She loved her books so much. In Jane Austen's letters, she talks about Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and her other novels as her babies and her children. That was the way she felt about them, and they obviously took on that role of importance in her life. So I think even if Jane Austen, at the end of her life, looked back over her life and thought that it was sad that she never got married, I think that if she had got married to someone she loved and had many, many children, maybe at the end of her life she'd have looked back over it and thought, oh, isn't it a shame I never did anything with my writing? So that's basically all I wanted to say. I haven't really come to any conclusions. I just wanted to have a general discussion questioning the idea that it's sad that Jane Austen never got married. Thank you for bearing with all my Jane Austen ramblings. I'm sorry. I promise this will be the last one for at least like maybe 2 months.